One of the patterns I see again and again is this. Someone sits across from me, looks at their numbers, and says, "I don't understand. I barely use salt." Their blood pressure is still high. Sometimes it has been high for years. And what makes this more concerning is that they're often doing many things right. They're trying to eat better. They're avoiding obvious junk food. They've made changes they believe should protect them. But something is still quietly pushing their blood pressure in the wrong direction. I'm Dr. Warren Hung, and on this channel, my goal is to help you understand how your body actually works so you can protect it, especially as things start to change after 55 or 60. If you find these explanations helpful, consider subscribing. This is where I break down the kinds of health patterns that are often missed until they become harder to reverse. Now, here is where the misunderstanding begins. Most people think of salt as something visible, something you sprinkle on food, something you can control simply by using less. So when they stop adding salt at the table, they assume the problem is handled. But the body doesn't measure salt based on what you see. It responds to what actually enters your bloodstream. And that difference is where the real issue starts. Because there is a form of intake that doesn't feel like a risk. It doesn't taste extreme. It doesn't trigger concern. And yet, over time, it steadily increases pressure inside your blood vessels. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, persistent way. The kind of change that builds slowly and often goes unnoticed until the numbers are already elevated. This matters even more as you get older. Because your body does not handle sodium the same way it did decades ago. Your kidneys, which are responsible for balancing fluids and filtering excess sodium, gradually become less efficient. They still work, but they don't respond as quickly or as precisely. At the same time, your blood vessels become less flexible. They don't expand as easily when pressure rises. So when extra sodium pulls more fluid into your bloodstream, the system has less ability to absorb that pressure safely. The result is simple, but important. Pressure rises more easily and stays elevated longer. That is one of the reasons why blood pressure tends to increase with age, even when habits don't seem dramatically different. Now, here is where false reassurance becomes dangerous. You can feel completely fine while this is happening. No pain, no warning signal, no clear symptom that tells you something is off. And because of that, many people assume that if they feel normal, their body must be handling things well. But blood pressure does not behave that way. It is often called a silent condition for a reason. The strain it places on your arteries happens quietly. The effect on your heart builds slowly. The impact on your kidneys develops without obvious signs. Over time, that constant pressure can contribute to serious outcomes like stroke, heart attack, or worsening kidney function. Not suddenly, but gradually, and that gradual progression is exactly what makes it easy to miss. Another layer to this is how everyday habits blend into routine. Things you use daily don't feel like decisions anymore. They feel automatic. A slice of bread, a ready-made sauce, a packaged item that seems harmless because it's labeled as normal food. These don't stand out. They don't feel like indulgences. But when they are repeated every day, they can quietly shift the balance inside your body. And because each individual choice seems small, the overall effect is rarely questioned. This is where many people get stuck. They are looking for a single, obvious cause. A clear mistake. Something dramatic they can remove. But in reality, the issue is often distributed across multiple, small, consistent exposures. Each one adds a little more sodium. Each one pulls a little more fluid into circulation. Each one nudges pressure slightly higher. Individually, they seem insignificant. Together, they create a pattern. And that pattern is what your body responds to. If you are over 60 or even approaching that age, this becomes more important, not less. Because the margin for error becomes smaller, the same intake that your body handled easily before may now have a stronger effect. The same routine that felt safe may now carry more weight. And this is not about eliminating everything you enjoy. It's about understanding where the hidden pressure is coming from so you can make targeted adjustments instead of guessing. Because when you understand the source, you regain control. And when you regain control, you reduce risk in a meaningful, measurable way. The key is recognizing that what feels harmless is not always neutral, especially when it is repeated daily. And once you see where that hidden intake is actually coming from, the entire picture of blood pressure control starts to change. The part that surprises people the most is not that sodium affects blood pressure. Most people already know that. What surprises them is where most of it actually comes from. It's not the salt shaker. It's not the pinch you add while cooking. It's the sodium already built into the foods you eat every day, hidden in plain sight. And because it doesn't taste overwhelmingly salty, it doesn't trigger concern. This is where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous. Because when patients tell me, I don't eat salty food, what they usually mean is, I don't add salt. But the body doesn't separate those two things. It only sees total intake. And in many cases, that total intake is much higher than expected. Let me explain what is happening inside the body in a simple way. Sodium plays a role in fluid balance. When you consume it, your body holds on to more water to maintain the right concentration in your blood. That extra water increases the volume of blood moving through your vessels. More volume means more pressure against the vessel walls. At the same time, sodium can affect how your blood vessels behave. In some people, especially as they get older, it makes the vessels more likely to stay slightly tightened instead of relaxing. So now you have two things happening together: more fluid inside the system, and vessels that are less able to expand. That combination raises blood pressure, and it does so quietly. Now, here is where age changes the equation. As the kidneys become less efficient, they don't remove excess sodium as effectively, so the body holds on to it longer. That means the effect on blood pressure lasts longer as well. This is what clinicians often refer to as increased salt sensitivity. Not everyone experiences it the same way, but it becomes more common with age, especially after 60, and in people with high blood pressure, diabetes, or kidney strain. And this is why two people can eat the same meal and respond differently. One person may handle it without much change. The other may see a noticeable rise in blood pressure over time. This difference is not always obvious day to day, but over months and years, it adds up. I remember a patient in his early 70s who came in frustrated with his readings. He told me very clearly that he had stopped adding salt completely. He was careful, he cooked at home, he avoided what he believed were salty foods. But his blood pressure remained elevated. When we looked more closely at his routine, something became clear. He was using packaged sauces regularly. He ate bread with most meals, and he relied on a few convenience items that seemed harmless because they weren't obviously salty. Individually, none of these choices stood out. But together, they were adding a significant amount of sodium every day. Once he became aware of that pattern and made a few targeted changes, his readings began to shift. Not overnight, but steadily. And this illustrates something important about how the body works. It's not just about what feels extreme. It's about what is consistent. Because the body responds to patterns more than isolated moments. Another point that often gets missed is taste adaptation. When you consume higher levels of sodium regularly, your taste receptors adjust. Food that contains a moderate amount of sodium starts to taste normal, not salty. So even when intake is high, it doesn't feel that way. This makes self-assessment unreliable. You can't depend on taste alone to tell you whether something is contributing to higher blood pressure. And this is where the real hidden risk lives. Not in occasional choices, but in repeated exposure that feels completely ordinary. Over time, that repeated exposure creates constant pressure inside the vascular system. That pressure affects the inner lining of your blood vessels. It contributes to stiffness. It increases the workload on your heart. And it can slowly impact organs that depend on stable blood flow, including the brain and the kidneys. This is how something that feels small can lead to larger consequences. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is persistent. And once you understand that, the focus shifts. Instead of trying to eliminate salt entirely, which is not realistic or necessary, the goal becomes much more practical. Identify where the hidden intake is coming from, because that is where the real leverage is. But once you start looking closely, you'll notice that these hidden sources are not random at all. They tend to show up in the same everyday foods people rely on without thinking. Once you understand that sodium is not just about what you add, the next step is seeing where it actually hides. And this is where patterns become very clear. The same types of foods come up again and again. Not because they are bad in a simple sense, but because they are used often and their sodium content is higher than most people expect. Let's go through 5 of the most common sources. These are items many people consume daily, often without realizing how much they contribute. 1. Bread and baked goods. This one surprises almost everyone. Bread doesn't taste salty. In fact, it often tastes neutral or even slightly sweet. But most commercially prepared bread contains a moderate amount of sodium per slice. On its own, one slice doesn't seem like much. But think about how often it appears in a day. Toast in the morning, a sandwich at lunch, another serving with dinner. Each serving adds a small amount. And because it's spread out, it never feels excessive. Over time, though, it becomes one of the largest contributors to daily sodium intake in many diets, especially in older adults who rely on simple, familiar meals. 2. Packaged sauces and condiments. This includes things like soy sauce, salad dressings, pasta sauces, marinades. These are designed to enhance flavor, and sodium is one of the easiest ways to do that. A small amount can contain a surprisingly high concentration. The issue here is not just the amount. It's the way these products are used. They're often added automatically, without measuring, without thinking. And because they are part of routine cooking or meal preparation, they don't feel like a choice. But from the body's perspective, they are a concentrated sodium source. 3. Processed meats. Items like deli meats, ham, bacon, sausages. These foods often contain sodium for preservation as well as flavor. Even small portions can carry a significant load, and they are commonly used in simple meals. A sandwich, a quick breakfast, a light dinner. The pattern again is repetition. Not necessarily large quantities at once, but frequent inclusion throughout the week. For someone monitoring blood pressure, this becomes an important category to be aware of. Number 4. Canned and ready-made foods. This includes canned soups, canned vegetables, ready meals, instant products. Sodium is often added to extend shelf life and maintain flavor. And while some products are labeled as reduced sodium, many standard versions contain more than expected. These foods are appealing because they are convenient, especially for older adults who may prefer quick preparation. But that convenience often comes with hidden intake. Again, not obvious by taste, but very clear when measured. 5. Healthy packaged foods. This is where confusion is most common. Items labeled as low fat, high protein, diet friendly, heart conscious can still contain significant sodium. Because when fat is reduced, flavor often needs to be replaced, and sodium is frequently used for that purpose. So a product that appears healthy in one way may still contribute to higher blood pressure in another. This creates a false sense of security. You feel like you're making a good choice, but the overall impact may not match that intention. Now, what connects all 5 of these categories is not just their sodium content. It's their frequency. They are not occasional foods. They are routine foods. They are part of daily eating patterns. And that is exactly why they matter. Because the body responds to what happens repeatedly, not just what happens occasionally. If you look at your own routine, you may notice some of these appearing more often than expected. A slice of bread here, a sauce there, a packaged item that feels convenient. Individually, each choice seems small, but together they create a steady level of sodium intake that can influence blood pressure over time. And because none of these feel extreme, they rarely get questioned. This is where awareness becomes powerful. Not to eliminate everything, but to recognize patterns. Because once you see the pattern, you can adjust it without completely changing the way you eat. And that becomes even more important when you understand how your body's response to these same foods changes as you get older. What often confuses people is this. They look at their habits and think, I've been eating this way for years. Why is it a problem now? And that question makes sense. Because in many cases, the foods haven't changed very much, but the body has. And that difference is what shifts the impact. Let's start with the kidneys. Your kidneys act as a filter. They regulate how much sodium and fluid stays in your body and how much is removed through urine. When you're younger, this system is more responsive. Excess sodium is cleared more efficiently. Fluid balance adjusts more quickly. But over time, that responsiveness slows down. The kidneys still work, but they don't react as precisely or as rapidly. So when extra sodium enters the system, it tends to stay longer. That means the body holds on to more fluid for longer periods. And as we discussed earlier, more fluid increases blood volume. More volume increases pressure. Now combine that with what happens to your blood vessels. Healthy arteries are flexible. They expand slightly when pressure rises, which helps absorb that force. But with age, vessels gradually become stiffer. This is sometimes referred to as reduced vascular compliance, which simply means the vessels don't stretch as easily. So now you have a situation where there is more fluid in the system, and the vessels are less able to adjust. That combination makes increases in blood pressure more likely. And when pressure rises, it also tends to stay elevated longer instead of returning to baseline quickly. This is one of the reasons clinicians often see stronger responses to sodium in older adults, even if intake looks similar on paper. Now, there is another layer that is important, especially if you take medication. Many blood pressure medications are designed to manage fluid balance or relax blood vessels. For example, diuretics help the body remove excess fluid. Other medications help vessels stay more relaxed. But when sodium intake remains high, it can work against these effects. It can make medications less effective. Not because the medication is wrong, but because the underlying input is pushing in the opposite direction. This can lead to a situation where doses are increased or additional medications are added when part of the issue is still coming from daily intake. This is something I see quite often. Patients assume that if they are taking medication, diet becomes less important. But in reality, the two work together. And when they are not aligned, control becomes more difficult. Another common form of false reassurance comes from lab results. Someone may look at their kidney function tests and see that they are within a normal range, and they take that as a sign that everything is functioning optimally. But normal does not always mean ideal, especially as you get older. It often means that the system is still within a broad reference range, but not necessarily operating at the same level it once did. So even without a clear diagnosis of kidney disease, your ability to handle sodium may already be reduced. And because that change happens gradually, it rarely feels noticeable, until blood pressure readings start to reflect it. Now, let's connect this to real outcomes. Persistent elevation in blood pressure increases strain on the inner lining of your arteries. Over time, that strain contributes to damage. It affects how blood flows. It increases the workload on the heart. It can accelerate changes that lead to narrowing or hardening of the vessels. And this is where the risks become more serious. Higher blood pressure is one of the strongest contributors to stroke. It also increases the likelihood of heart attack, and it places ongoing stress on the kidneys, which can further reduce their ability to regulate fluid and electrolytes. This creates a cycle. Reduced kidney function leads to more fluid retention. More fluid retention raises blood pressure. Higher blood pressure puts more strain on the kidneys, and the cycle continues. The important point here is not to create alarm. It is to clarify why something that once seemed manageable can become more significant over time, and why paying attention to these patterns earlier can make a meaningful difference. Because even small reductions in daily sodium intake can help shift this balance. They can reduce fluid retention. They can lower pressure inside the vessels. They can improve how well medications work. And over time, they can reduce the strain on critical organs. This is not about perfection. It's about direction, and understanding that the same habits carry different weight as your body changes. And once you see how these changes affect your body, it becomes much easier to build a simple routine that keeps your blood pressure more stable day to day. Once you see where the pressure is coming from, the next step becomes much more practical. Not strict, not complicated, just more precise. Because the goal is not to remove everything from your diet. It's to reduce the sources that quietly add up without your awareness. Let's turn everything we've discussed into something you can actually use day to day. Start with this simple idea. You don't need to guess. You just need to look in the right places. The first step is awareness. When you're in your kitchen, begin noticing which foods fall into the categories we talked about. Bread, sauces, processed meats, canned or ready-made meals, packaged, healthy foods. You don't have to eliminate them all. Just identify how often they appear in your routine. That alone often reveals more than expected. The second step is prioritization. You don't need to change everything at once. Pick 1 or 2 categories that show up the most in your daily meals. For some people, it's bread. For others, it's sauces or convenience foods. Start there, because small reductions in high-frequency items can have a meaningful effect. The third step is substitution. Instead of removing something completely, look for a lower sodium alternative. Many products now come in reduced sodium versions. Fresh ingredients can often replace packaged ones. Even simple changes, like adjusting how much sauce is used, can lower intake without changing the entire meal. The goal is not restriction. It's adjustment. The fourth step is label awareness. This is one of the most useful habits you can build. When you look at a food label, focus on sodium per serving, not just the total amount in the package, and pay attention to how many servings you actually consume. Because sometimes what is labeled as one serving is much smaller than what people typically eat. You don't need to memorize numbers. Just start comparing. Over time, you'll begin to recognize which foods consistently contain more sodium, and that awareness becomes automatic. The fifth step is pattern tracking. You don't need a detailed journal, just a simple mental check. Ask yourself, did most of my meals today include packaged or prepared items? Was there a source of added sodium in each meal? If the answer is yes, then small adjustments can make a difference. Now, here is something important to keep in mind. This is not about eliminating sodium completely. Your body needs sodium to function. The issue is excess. And excess is usually not coming from a single meal. It's coming from repeated daily exposure. So the goal is consistency in the right direction, not perfection. Another practical step is monitoring your blood pressure in a structured way. If you check it at home, try to do it at the same time each day, in a calm state, not immediately after activity or stress. This helps you see patterns more clearly. And if you make dietary changes, it allows you to observe whether those changes are having an effect. This kind of feedback is useful because it connects your actions to measurable results, and that reinforces the habit. If you are on medication, this becomes even more important because changes in sodium intake can influence how your body responds to those medications. Sometimes improving diet allows for better control without needing additional adjustments. But that is something to discuss with your doctor, especially if you notice consistent changes in your readings. Now, let me bring this together in a simple framework you can remember. Look at your routine. Identify the repeated sources. Reduce the highest frequency contributors. Replace where possible. Stay aware of labels. And observe how your body responds. That's it. No extreme rules. No complicated system. Just a focused way of reducing what your body doesn't need in excess. Because when you remove the hidden pressure, your system has a better chance to stabilize. Your vessels experience less strain. Your heart doesn't have to work as hard. And your kidneys are under less constant demand. These are small shifts, but they affect systems that operate every minute of every day. Before we close, I want to leave you with one simple reflection. If you looked at your meals today, which of these hidden sources showed up the most? That's often the best place to begin. If this kind of explanation helps you make sense of your health, consider subscribing. That way, you can keep building a clearer picture of how these everyday patterns affect your body over time. And if one part of this stood out to you or something sounded familiar, let me know. That kind of feedback helps guide what we focus on next. The key idea to carry forward is this: what feels normal is not always neutral. And once you understand that, you can start making changes that actually protect your long-term health.